O God, may your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen.
Good afternoon, members. Minister's statement. The Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to offer our condolences and pay tribute to Cease Hodgson Macaulay, who passed away last Sunday at the age of 95. The Northwest Territories is built on a legacy of those who come before us and paved a way for the next generation. The people who stood tall and were the outspoken voices in the crowd when change was needed most. These people and their legacy are part of what makes the North strong and unique, and Cease Hodgson Macaulay is one of those people. Born on the shores of Great Bear Lake in 1922, Cease lived her life as a proud Indigenous Northerner. At an early age, Cease attended Sacred Heart Mission School in Fort Providence after the loss of her mother. She always had the best interests of others at heart and was continually encouraging others to stand up for what they believed in and reminding them to always be truthful and do the right thing. Mr. Speaker, Cease was a pioneer and inspiration for all people, but especially Indigenous people, women in leadership. She was the first female chief in the N.W.T. and the founding chief of the Nuvik Band. She was also a former president of the Norman Wells Land Corporation, a fierce woman, a warrior of the Saulteaux. Cease worked until the very end, writing her outspoken column for the News North. In her column and in life, Cease always spoke her mind and wasn't afraid to be herself. Throughout her life and career, she touched many people and communities across the North and Canada. She was a supporter and often a critic of government and encouraged Northerners to get involved in causes that mattered to them. She was a reminder that sometimes to see change, you need to make your voice heard, and showed us this firsthand as a strong voice for the Mackenzie Valley Highway. Cease was a leader in all respects, and in 2017, she received an Inspire Award for Politics. Cease recently wrote her final editorial for the News North, and in it she acknowledged that she had had a wonderful life and felt blessed for her family and the things she was able to do with her time on earth. We are all grateful to have known Cease and know that even though she may be gone, her memory and impression she has left on this territory will forever remain. Mr. Speaker, the Premier, along with some of his colleagues from this House, are in Norman Wells today to attend Cease's memorial service. On behalf of him and the government of the Northwest Territories, I would like to pass along our sincere condolences to the family of Cease Hodgson Macaulay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mercy. Our condolences to the family as well. Minister's statement. Minister Ike Godani, the Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to advise members that the Premier and Minister responsible for the status of women will be absent from the House today to attend a funeral in Norman Wells. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mercy. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statements. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in May and June of 2017, a series of meetings were held to solidify feedback from age groups in Fort Simpson regarding community wellness. Information was gathered, compiled, and the community wellness plan was completed in July 2017 that addressed some of the concerns of the community members. They were bullying and cyberbullying, not enough activities for youth and family offered, unresolved grief and trauma associated residential school, not enough mental health services and counselors available in the community. Information about these services were not disseminated effectively, drug and alcohol abuse, to name a number of them, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on April 1st, 2017 to date, I would like to highlight some of these things that the community has been doing. Interagency meeting were reinstated and improved communication between community agencies and service providers between ourselves and the community. 10-day Youth on the Land camp was held at the Culture Camp from July 31st to August 9th, 2017. Another one's planned this year. A 3-day on-the-land camp, a workshop for adults grieving to self-heal was held in July. Local in the village of Fort Simpson hosted the week-long regional youth Denny Games in August. The Real Youth Anti-Bullying Film Workshop was undertaken in October. All students from grade 7 through 12 were given the opportunity to participate, and several films were created. The Lights On program was started in October. Paid supervisors and adult volunteers kept the high school open on Friday and Saturday nights from 8 to 12 midnight for students from grade 7 to 12. Between 25 and 50 youth attended each night. An Elders Appreciation Dinner was held in December where elders were honored, received gifts, and were served by a group of volunteer high school students. LKFN assisted with planning, presentation, delivery evening programs for the Youth Mental Health Conference that was held at the high school February 2018. I will be doing a member statement tomorrow on this. A group of 10 and 2 chaperones traveled to the Wisdom to Action youth-led suicide prevention program conference in Vancouver. I will be doing a member statement later on on this next sitting. An Elders and Youth Film-Making project is beginning March. Northern study students will be creating films of their interviews with the community elders. KFN will operate a 4-plex unit that will host 4 people who have been homeless.
Member Nahende, your time for member statements expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Massey, member seeking unanimous consent to conclude a statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks, colleagues. As I said, the LKFN will be operating a 4-plex housing unit that will be housing 4 people who have been homeless for 180 days in the past year. The program is called Pathways to Housing and is a solid beginning to solve our homeless issue. The project will be fully underway by April 1st. I'd like to thank the various departments that help with these projects: Municipal and Community Affairs, Education, Culture and Employment, Health and Social Services, Housing, and Environment and Natural Resources. If I missed any other departments, I thank them for helping this community and our region out. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey, member statement. Member Ika Goodan and the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we've spent a lot of time in the 18th Assembly talking about the importance of a diversified economy. We want to rely less on one big sector, so we are supporting other sectors like tourism, agriculture, and the creative arts. We'll continue to nurture and grow these areas so that they become sustainable sources of jobs and wealth. But how do we get there, Mr. Speaker? We need to have more post-secondary choices available here in the North. We also need to make sure that our students who choose to go to school elsewhere are well equipped to face those challenges. In particular, we need to encourage Indigenous students to pursue post-secondary programs. A study from the Canada Millennium Scholarship Foundation finds that there are barriers to post-secondary education for Indigenous students. Those barriers include a lack of financial resources and a lack of academic preparation. Indigenous students feel unwelcome on post-secondary campuses. Plus, more Indigenous students are already married and raising children, or are single and raising children at the age when they are eligible for post-secondary programs. Mr. Speaker, the common phrase is that our young people are our future. If that's true, and we imagine a future full of possibility and growth, we need to remove these barriers to allow our young people to follow their dreams. Our post-secondary programs that succeed, such as Aurora College and Deshinta Bush University, offer students the chance to achieve the skills needed to build their lives and careers without leaving the North. That is a capacity that we must build and grow, Mr. Speaker, and we can build on it on our terms. That's also the lesson of the Deshinta Bush University, which takes a unique northern approach to higher learning. It incorporates the knowledge of Dene elders and knowledge holders. Instead of bringing students inside a classroom, it takes education onto the land. It provides full daycare services focused on Dene language and traditions, so young families don't have to choose between education and the wage economy. Significantly, Deshinta has a dropout rate of 0. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey, member seeking unanimous consent to conclude his statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, colleagues. Mr. Speaker, our students who choose to leave the North to pursue their educational dreams must be well equipped. Our generous student financial assistance program ensures that financial factors should not be a barrier to their success. Our system must focus on producing students who are well-rounded, confident, and capable as any in the world. Mr. Speaker, we need to continue to build an education system that reduces barriers to success. Our young people may choose to stay home or to venture beyond our borders. Either way, our system must make sure that they are ready to face those challenges, to build the future that they dream is possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike-Godin and the member Kamlik.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. The Department of Education, Culture and Employment recently released a discussion paper on governance of post-secondary education in the Northwest Territories, a discussion paper that I've been eagerly awaiting for some time, given my commitment to accountable and relevant post-secondary education in the Northwest Territories. The mandate of our government states that the N.W.T will begin to expand opportunities for post-secondary education, trades-oriented learning, and northern education institutions. This discussion paper contains some important statements. The discussion paper focuses on the need for quality assurance to ensure that if students study in the N.W.T, then their qualifications will stand up anywhere in the world. What this discussion paper lays out explicitly is that quality assurance is critical to sound fiscal investment in post-secondary education. However, there is currently no quality assurance for Aurora College programs that are not rented from other jurisdictions. And as I understand it, it is the Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment who approves these programs. How is it then, fiscally and socially responsibility, as suggested by this discussion paper, that Aurora College will not be subject to the rigors of the changes to the Education Act? Further to the discussion paper, Mr. Speaker, how is it that Aurora College, with the vast majority of its programs unaccredited, will remain the only public-funded body that can provide adult learning in the Northwest Territories? We need to lead as a jurisdiction to implement evidence-based best practices for all of our financial investments. Given what little data on success rates and success outcomes are at the college, how can this government continue to support a post-secondary governance position where the future of N.W.T post-secondary education will be monopolized by a failing arm of education, culture, and employment when Indigenous self-governments and student-focused success stories like DAY26 are relegated to private Indigenous institutions that can only be privately funded, with only the possibility of small and uncertain government grants. The situation of accreditation at the college is even more curious when you consider that a post-secondary institution in the N.W.T already has a form of quality assurance for its courses without a need for legislative change or a foundational review. That's DAY26 Bush University, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, sound and accountable investments in post-secondary education is the cornerstone of future labor market success. We need to do this now, we need to move on, and we need to make sure we're supporting all of our institutions, not just those that are run by this government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement Ike-Godin and the member Deschaux.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. This government's mandate calls for expanded post-secondary education for our students and to act on the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Right in the mandate, it stated that 83% of our people with post-secondary education have a job. But despite pressure from standing committees, regular members, and the public, we have seen course offerings from Aurora College cut, not expanded, even in the areas where future demand will be high. Neither have we seen expansion of post-secondary opportunities at other institutions. There is still no practical pathway to establish colleges or universities. We're still waiting for this legislation, Mr. Speaker. Where is our government's vision? There are tremendous opportunities for Indigenous education and research that could benefit our territory for generations. This summer, for example, students from DAY26 Bush University travel up to Detroit for a semester. Their learning was led by such professors as Sam Gargan, Jim Antoine, and Ethel Lamotte, partnered with the N.W.T language program. Students learned Dene place names, family history, and the history of colonization. Both Dene and non-Indigenous students were immersed in Dene culture and heritage. This is how we build a future, Mr. Speaker. In addition, I'm told this program brought more than $600,000 of outside investment to the Detroit, Satu, and Beaufort Delta regions. This is the knowledge economy in action. DAY26 has the potential to expand this economy and offer new and exciting opportunities to our students. It is highly regarded with programs open to all and accredited by 3 Canadian universities. Half of our population is Indigenous. Our traditional knowledge is strong, and we could be leaders in Indigenous education in Canada. Mr. Speaker, it has taken this government 2 years to do a discussion paper on the future of post-secondary education, and yet there's no detail of how best practices in Indigenous education, just a mention of private Indigenous institutes. There is no mention of the TRC's calls to action in education. Indigenous education represents our greatest opportunity, but I'm sorry to note that there was a similar lack of vision for other growing post-secondary institutions, including College Nordique. I will have questions for the Education Minister. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godin and the member Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, about a year ago, the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment announced that the social work program and the teacher education program offered at Aurora College would be phased out. He said he made the decision on the basis of low graduation rates from both programs. When I questioned him at the time, he was unsure why the rates were so low or what barriers students faced in completing the programs. The lingering question is whether the minister was willing to invest any effort into improving the programs before axing them. Mr. Speaker, Aurora College decided to find answers to these questions themselves by launching a review of the social work program under the leadership of the Vice President of Education and Training. The review is to gauge how to improve student retention and success, to document barriers, recommend the best approach to achieve the objectives of the program, and to assess the quality of the program offered. This is the work that should have been done before the minister made the decision to phase out the program. Mr. Speaker, the social work program has been around in different forms since 1982, and it has been reviewed and revamped several times, most recently 20 years ago. Students who finish the current program earn a certificate in social work and have the option to continue on to complete a degree. Mr. Speaker, as of the year 2000, there were over 100 social work diploma graduates in the N.W.T, so the number today is obviously much greater. Demand for social workers in the N.W.T is strong. The Department of Education, Culture and Employment estimates the N.W.T will need an additional 158 social workers between 2015 and 2030. These are good jobs that pay an average of $69,000 a year. These are also jobs that are typically filled by women. Mr. Speaker, social workers are the primary drivers of community development in the places they work. They are an indispensable support for community wellness. Having Northern social workers drive Northern community development is obviously a good idea. Training Northern residents to be social workers in the North also makes sense, with a record of success stretching back 2 decades. The program review underway now will help improve the program, but only if the minister accepts its recommendations. I will have questions. Merci.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godin and the member Trinidad Willade.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker,
today, the kids that are going out to school and
Speaker, in recent years, this government has truly began to prioritize summer students, whether by enhancing our summer student financial assistance or helping them find employment within the graduate internship or summer student employment programs. The success of the N.W.T's efforts in this regard is demonstrated by our government's consistently winning accolades as one of Canada's top employers, specifically one of Canada's top employers for young people in Canada and the best diversity employer. Ms. Speaker, it's great that our achievements can be recognized and we should all be proud of that. However, we cannot lose the momentum we've gained in helping our students. We must continue to work diligently in providing fruitful opportunities for our students because, quite simply, they are our future. Ms. Speaker, today I would like to bring forth some new ideas that can help expand opportunities for summer students in the N.W.T. While I strongly support employing as many students as possible, I believe our government can go beyond only trying to employ students within the G&WT, as there are other ways to widen the job pool for students. Ms. Speaker, in Alberta, there is a wage subsidy program that provides funding to eligible employees as a way to financially incentivize the hiring of high school and post-secondary students into summer jobs. In essence, the provincial government pays for a part of the student's salary while they work during the summer. Another idea, Mrs. Speaker, is to create a new tax credit that would be conducive for northern employers in helping to offset the cost of hiring summer students. With this idea, businesses would be allowed to claim the cost on their tax returns. Ms. Speaker, our students should have a diverse selection of job opportunities that spans across all economic centres. I urge our government to consider these investments in the future in order to best serve our leaders of the territory, our future leaders, our students. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Godin and the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. The N.W.T's minimum wage is increasing April 1 from $12.50 to $13.46 per hour. It's good news that more money is going into the pockets of our underemployed workers. But in the end, the minimum wage is a blunt instrument for addressing poverty. We need to stop tinkering and take a more comprehensive approach. As the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment says, his decision to raise the minimum wage follows recommendations of the Minimum Wage Committee report, which is itself not a very satisfactory or independent process. The committee has 2 government representatives, one of whom chairs, 2 employee representatives, 2 from employers, and 1 from a social agency. 2 other government employees with finance served as consultants. This is the committee's second report, which is almost verbatim the same as the report produced in 2014. Both reports presented 3 options for a minimum wage rate, linking it to the average industrial hourly wage. This year, the committee recommended 3 options: no change, or an increase to $13.46 or $14.96 per hour. The report observes raising the minimum wage rate will, quote, have little bearing on, end of quote, on many Northerners living in poverty, because fewer than 1,100 of the 21,000 workers in the N.W.T make less than $15 an hour. The additional fact that the minimum wage isn't even indexed adds to this problem. The work done on a living wage in Yellowknife highlights the problems with our low minimum wage. Twice now, rigorously researched reports have set a living wage for Yellowknife according to a nationally recognized calculation of the actual expenses for an extremely basic standard of living. It sets the necessary income for a family of 4 with a child in school and a child in daycare at almost $9 per hour higher than the minimum wage. And that's Yellowknife, not the much more costly smaller communities. Recommendations from the Living Wage Report point out that by readjusting income thresholds for government programs, a lower living wage is possible if wealth were being progressively redistributed. In the end, a minimum wage is little more than a statement of political acceptability. If you start with a premise that someone who is working for a minimum wage should be out of poverty, a living wage is what we should be aiming for. I'll have questions for the Minister later today. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member statement. Returns oral questions. Returns oral questions. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Galleries, I'd like to turn your attention to visitors in the gallery. We have with us Mr. Sam Gargan, former speaker, former member, and also former the chief as well. And I'd like to recognize Chief Eddie Sangris, Chief of DERA. Welcome to our assembly. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Trinity Willoughby.
Mr. Speaker, I too would like to recognize Chief Eddie Sanger, Chief of YK Denny First Nations, and also like to recognize Catherine Lafferty, Director of Operations at Chincha University. Thank you.
Masi. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize the youngest grandson, Ezra James Welly, first time in the Legislative Assembly with his mother, Jacqueline Welly, and her father-in-law, Sean Welly, who is a council member for the Village of Fort Sumter. Welcome to the Legislative Assembly.
Masi. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I too would like to recognize the representatives from Deshinta, in particular Catherine Lafferty, who is here as the Director of Operations, also Elder Sam Gargan, and I also would like to recognize Chief Eddie Sangres at this time. Welcome to the House. Thank you for being here.
Masi. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I too would like to recognize Chief Eddie Sangres. Also at the same time, Sam Gargan, a constituent of mine from Fort Providence, and also I did recognize him as a professor. I recognize him as an elder as well. Of course, a former speaker from the Assembly, so I'd like to recognize him. And plus, from the Deshinta University, Catherine Lafferty. Merci.
Masi. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Inuvik Boot Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to also welcome and recognize Catherine Lafferty, Director of Community Development and Indigenous Education for Deshinta Center for Research and Learning, as well as her little entourage of supporters and people that do the work in the organization. Welcome, Masi.
Masi. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. If we miss anyone in the gallery, welcome to our assembly. It's always nice to have an audience as part of our proceedings. Masi. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Oral questions. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have questions for the Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment about the future post-secondary in the Northwest Territories. I want to be crystal clear. I appreciate the hard work that happens at Aurora College, and I think if there's any issues that need to be addressed, it needs to be addressed by this government. Aurora College is unique in Canada, and perhaps the world, in how it is funded, how it is operated, and we see a lot of involvement from this department in the day-to-day operations, program course offerings, all those kind of things. We need to cut the strings on this, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister what if he envisions a future for Aurora College where it will become an independent university or post-secondary institution that is research-driven and has the academic freedom to be accountable to government funding, but completely separate from the N.W.T. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Currently at this time, no. We do have public funds that fund the Aurora College, and we partner with them to look at their program services that they provide to residents of the Northwest Territories. What I can let the member know is that we are working currently on a overarching legislation that will bring other possibilities of post-secondary institutes here to the Northwest Territories, as well as working with Deshinta Research and Learning Center, College Nordique, that will offer those opportunities. So we are on the right path. Right now, we're going to work with Aurora College. We do fund them through public dollars to do those programs and services for the people of the North. But I think as we move forward, after the foundational review is complete, as well as the legislation working on developing that, we'll start to see that this government is moving in that direction. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. Nakita Cassie, member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm not advocating that the public funding for the Aurora College be cut. Far from it. There are other universities in Canada that receive public funding, but are independent academic institutions. So how can the minister reassure me and others that for the nearly $30 million we invest in Aurora College's operations, that we are delivering the highest quality programs that can stand up in other jurisdictions without proper accreditation? Can the minister confirm that what the students are learning at Aurora College can be used elsewhere in Canada? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, I know one of our best programs that we do have at Aurora College is the nursing degree program. And we're also working with them on this foundational review that's going to address some of the accreditation, quality assurance concerns that members have brought up on numerous occasions. That foundational review, we should have that to me by the end of this month, and we'll be taking a look at those recommendations that's going to be in that final report moving forward. But I hear what the member's saying, and moving forward, we want to make sure that anyone that takes any programs with any of our post-secondary institutions will be able to have that opportunity to go and practice their career and their training elsewhere throughout Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I heard one program involved. So out of all of the program offerings at Aurora College, can the minister give me a percentage of how many of those meet accreditation standards outside of the Northwest Territories? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have that detail of the percentage of programs that are being currently run throughout any of our 3 campuses in the Northwest Territories at the moment, but I can look at getting that information for the member and sharing it with them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, Member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the minister's commitment. Mr. Speaker, the other areas that are required for a successful university or post-secondary institution is independence and, of course, an institution driven by research. Aurora College has ARI, the Aurora Research Institute, but what it doesn't have is an independent board. When will the minister reappoint an independent board so the college can be at arm's length from government and control its own affairs? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As members of the House know, and I'm sure the public knows, we are going through currently going through a foundational review. I did mention that review is going to be given to me by the end of this month, and we will be creating a management response to that review. And in that review, governance is a topic of priority to take a look at. So once we get that foundation review, we will develop a management response to some of those recommendations. Should the board be one of the recommendations, we will take a look at it. And once the management response and the review is complete, we will be sharing that with committee members, all members of the Legislative Assembly, and our stakeholders. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, the member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in my member statement today, I spoke about some of the things that the community of Fort Simpson has done to address the tragedies that have occurred in the past year. I have some questions for the Minister of Health and Social Services and hopefully clear up some stuff. Can the Minister tell us what the department has been able to do in response to the number of tragedies in the Detroit region in 2017? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our first priority when a tragedy like this happens is to work with the families, to make sure that we have counselors and other supports meeting with the family to help them address their grief and their loss. That's always the first priority, and that is something that we made available in the Detroit region. We also recognize that given the large number of incidents and crises that were happening in the Detroit, that there was a significant demand on all the workers in the community in the region who were reaching out to community members and families. So we also made councils from other communities from across the Northwest Territories available so that they can come in and provide some backfill and some additional supports to the community, given that there were a large number of people who were seeking help and wanted to receive supports during these crises. So we also had individuals from the headquarters come down as well and meet with the community. So there was first reach out to the families, and there was additional community people, additional supports came in from different communities, and then the departments were able to provide some support in the communities. We had a number of good conversations with residents in the community about the types of things they need, and we're continuing to work with the community and the region to try to find some additional solutions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question na kira Council Member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister and his department for the work that they were doing, and thanks for that information. As I said in my member statement today, there was a lot of departments that have been part of the support network. Can Minister advise how the department has been working with other departments and organizations to ensure that everybody's aware of each other's services, including the mental health and addiction staff, child and family services staff, the victim services staff, and education, culture, and employment staff? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as a government, this is certainly one area that we can do better in, is to break down some of our silos and make sure that staff in one department know what's going on in another department. We have been trying to work with our partners to make sure information is shared, and we have been able to collaborate on a number of initiatives. We have been able to work with community members in the Decho region. We have participated with them on different events. On February, for example, 7th to 8th, the Department of Staff attended workshops in Fort Simpson that offered mental wellness, suicide prevention, as well as what will it take program, and talk about mental illness, which is often referred to as TAMI program. And the speakers traveled with our staff so that we had an opportunity to talk about the types of programs that are available both through health and social services, but also through communities and other agencies. I know that the federal government has supports that they provide in different situations at different times. So I think we all need to work together, Mr. Speaker, to try and get the information that we're all doing. This isn't something that one department, one government can solve. This is something that's going to take everybody working together. And we're going to work harder to make sure that the information on the programs we're offering is out there, and I look forward to working with the member to help get some of that information out over time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. Tado Council Member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that answer from the Minister. In regards to the plan to support families, staff, and communities that have been impacted by these tragedies, can the Minister advise some of the things the department is able to offer? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, first and I guess foremost is that we do offer and we do make our counsellors available to the families who are struggling so that they can continue to work through their grief process and come to terms with the horrible incidents that have occurred. But we want to do more than that. We want to support communities as well. We strongly encourage residents of communities who attend things like the mental health first aid program as well as the applied suicide intervention skills training. The more people that can attend these things in the communities, the better, and that includes the families as well. We work with the Territorial Authority, Health and Social Services Authority, and community leadership to develop a wellness and suicide prevention plan. And that work is still underway. We haven't completely reached our resolution on that plan. The department offers On the Land Healing Fund, $125,000 a year, which goes to the Decho First Nation so that they can facilitate on-the-land programs that lead towards healing and supporting individuals who are going through crisis. And there's also always, Mr. Speaker, the helpline is available to residents. Should they need to speak to somebody now. I would strongly encourage people to use that helpline and engage with the practitioners we have in the community, whether it's a community health nurse, a counselor. In September next year, the new youth mental health counselors, we encourage them to reach out and get in touch with the providers that are out there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. Nudere Council Member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I greatly appreciate the Minister's ability to provide that information here to the House as we can share it with our residents. So, Mr. Speaker, can the Minister provide a brief summary on some of the things the Department has been able to do in regards to the suicide prevention, treatment, and aftercare as part of the action, the Mental Health and Addiction Recovery and N.W.T Strategic Framework 2016 to 2021. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the framework that the member is referencing is a foundational document that sets the direction how we're going to move forward in a number of different areas. It is going to result in 3 different action plans. One of the actions plan, the Youth Mental Health and Addictions Action Plan, has already been released. The Addictions Recovery Action Plan and the Mental Health Recovery Action Plan are still in development, and they'll be developed during the 18-19 fiscal year. Having said that, with respect to the Youth Mental Health and Addictions Action Plan, one of the key items that I think residents of the DAY26 as well as other communities will recognize is the implementation of the Youth Mental Health and Addictions Counselors, which will be health and social services employees working in the schools, providing supports to our youth. But there's also the Territorial Suicide Prevention and Crisis Response Network, which is something that the members told us clearly that we needed to put in place to support communities in times of crisis. And we are moving forward with that. It was a great recommendation. We have some financial support from the federal government that is allowing us to make this happen. And this is about pulling together and developing a culturally safe, common suicide risk assessment tool. It's about ensuring that there's seamless pathways so that when a community is in crisis, we can get them the support they need, both internally but externally. And it's about establishing clear processes to allow these things to happen so that the responses are swift, timely, appropriate, and respectful. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Kennedy, the member Yellowknife Center.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I said in my member statement, there's a review of the social work program underway now at Aurora College, and the report is due on April 10th. My question is for the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. Why wasn't this review completed prior to making the decision to phase out the social work program? Mussey.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, we made the decision to phase out the social work program based on low enrollment and low graduation rates. It had a history of low rates over the years. The Aurora College decided to do independent internal review on its own, and I do understand that that review is going to be completed in April 2018, and we'll see where that review and what recommendations that review has in terms of moving forward with the long-term strategic plan for the Aurora College. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mussey. Oral question, Nakita Cassie, member Yellowknife Center.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when the minister gets the report, can the minister request the report? What does he plan to do with it? Thank you.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We can possibly review that report, but because it is an internal document and an internal review that the Aurora College has taken on, my understanding that because it is an internal document that is not planned for a release to the public. I can follow up with the Aurora College on that, though, but because it is their own internal review, it's something that will not be released to the public. Thank you. And as I mentioned earlier, that that can help position what that program is in terms of looking at a long-term strategic plan for Aurora College after all of our other work around the foundational reviews complete as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tada Cassie, member Yellowknife Center.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, what I'm asking the minister is, when he sees this report, this college is under administration, and so he has a direct role in its governance. When he asks for this report and receives it, what is he going to do with the results? I'm not asking him to make it public. He has a terrible record of making things public. I'm asking what he is going to do with the report. Thank you.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we are excited to see what this internal review is going to recommend at the end. As I mentioned, we do have a diploma program with the social workers, social work students that are coming out of the program. And we continue to support them to go and get their degree, whether it's in a southern institution or going over to Yukon College. What comes out of that review We're not too sure what it's going to look like, but we will take it into consideration when the foundation review is complete and we have that managerial response complete as well. It'll help us set a stage for the long-term strategic plan of Aurora College, and we'll see what recommendations come out of this internal review and how that will impact as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, N.W.T member, Yellowknife Center.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if the foundational review and/or the review of the social work program recommends that the program be continued or expanded into a degree program, is the minister willing to phase out his decision, willing to reverse his decision to phase the program out? Thank you.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we have a lot of things that we're doing right now in post-secondary initiatives. It's a very ambitious agenda. We have the foundation review that's going to help us decide the direction of how Aurora College will be providing its programs and services, but we also have this overarching legislation that's going to help other post-secondary institutions come up, do research, also possibly look at providing degree-granting programs. We have the Research and Learning, Collège Nordique that's going to be involved in that. If it looks like we can look at providing a degree-granting program, we'll definitely look hard at that because we want to make sure that we do meet the needs of the labour market here in the Northwest Territories, as well as all three Northern Territories and, if possible, other jurisdictions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, the member Decho.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are to the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. Earlier I spoke about the link between post-secondary education and people's ability to get good jobs. We're all aware of the earning disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in the Northwest Territories, yet this government is cutting Aurora College programs and failing to expand support for other growing institutions such as Deshaunta Bush University. Why has the government taken this course? Merci.
Merci. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we want to ensure that any programs that we provide to residents of the Northwest Territories, we want to make sure that they have the supports, they have the skills necessary to be into the labour market within the Northwest Territories. We also want to make sure that when we're investing dollars into our programs, we're getting good output of skilled, trained workers to meet the labour market demands. We also support a lot of our other programs. We support Collège Nordique. We signed a multi-year agreement with Deshaunta Learning Centre and Research, and we also increased the funding with Deshaunta over the past couple of years. So we're continuing to support our post-secondary institutions, whether it's Aurora College, Collège Nordique, Deshaunta, and we're also looking at ways we can invite and bring other post-secondary institutions up to do research and provide other services to our residents. So we're continuing to work on our agenda for post-secondary education. I think we're doing a great job on that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, the member Decho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I clearly understand the minister supports all the initiatives that he has outlined. Yet, Mr. Speaker, Ontario has 9 Indigenous governed and operated post-secondary institutions. New legislation provides a pathway for them to offer post-secondary degrees, certificates, and diplomas. The province will spend $56 million over the next 3 years to expand the capacity of Indigenous institutes. Will the minister look at this model and revise this discussion paper to reflect best practices? Merci.
Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we see the important work of the work that Deshaunta is doing, as well as other organizations here in the Northwest Territories that promote culture and language, and we work with those organizations to continue to support it. And although there is none as such as the member has mentioned here in the Northwest Territories, it is unique, and it's something that I think we do need to look at, because we're already doing it in our JK to 12 system, and that's something we can look at moving forward as we embark on our post-secondary agenda and looking at improving some of the work in that area that the member has specifically identified. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, tada day, Council Member Deschaux.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it may not be possible for institutions like Dishontan College Nordique to grow and prosper without more public funding than they get now. This funding could open the door to much more investment beyond our territory. For example, this summer, Dishontan went on a river. What is the minister going to do about this and live up to the mandate commitment to expand post-secondary opportunities for our students? Merci.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do know that College Nordique as well as Deshint are looking to expand their roles, and I think that was a great program that they did this summer, traveling up and down the Mackenzie River. And we continue to support our these post-secondary institutions, as well as looking at how ways we can help sustain the work that they do. That's one of the reasons we did enter into that multi-year agreement with the Shinta and increase their funding. As I've mentioned in this House, over a period of times that we are creating this overarching legislation that's going to look at accreditation, quality assurance, and also look at opportunities that will give Deshint and College Nordique more opportunities and more opportunities to expand and have accredited courses. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, no dire, Council Member Deschaux.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this time of the year, there might be students out there listening to this debate and discussion, and more likely those students are looking for ideas and assurances that when they enter perhaps rural college or programs this fall, that there will be programs and there will be a classroom, they will have a desk, they will have resources, they will have professors. So my question is to the Minister, what kind of hope can he give to students that potentially may enter, say, a rural college or the social work program this fall? Merci.
Merci. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we mentioned, we're going through the business planning process, and I did say in this House that this fall we won't be taking any more intakes into the social work program. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, he could the member Trinity will day.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in my member statement, I talked about the upcoming summer student program. I have questions for the Minister of Finance. I'd like to ask the Minister of Finance a question on what happened last year. Last year, the government of Northwest Territories set a record for probably the most summer students ever hired in the N.W.T. I'd like to ask the Minister if he plans to exceed that number this year. Thank you.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the member is correct. Last year we had 349 summer students, and we were quite pleased with that number. And they were spread across the departments and across the government. And I'm just going to read off the top 3 departments just to let them out there know who'd been hiring all the summer students. Number 1 was Department of Infrastructure, but that included Public Works and Transportation, so we're not sure if that really counts. Number 2 was N.W.T. Health and Social Services Authorities. They had 62 summer students last year. Number 3 was E&R at 51. We've encouraged our departments to try bring on more summer students, so we would like to see that number increase, and we will work very hard to see that number increase. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Council Member Trinity will day.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Minister for that response. I'd like to ask the Minister if the Minister would look at other subsidies. I know that we get around 600 applications for summer students, and hiring 350 is good, or 400 is better, but there are other incentives around, like what I talked about, wage subsidies to what the government in Alberta is doing. Would the Minister consider looking at something like wage subsidies for employers other than the N.W.T for that hire summer students? Thank you.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when I quoted the numbers before, the 349, I have asked a couple of times now, and I'll follow up on it today, on the number of summer students that agencies that we fund also hire, because we've got 23, I think, local housing authorities, maybe 24 now, and I'm sure they bring on summer students as well. So if you average out 2 or 3 per LHO, then that would increase the numbers. We have the community governments whom we fund that bring on summer students. They're not included in the 349. So I would think that number would be a lot higher. But I've been trying to gather that information for a while now. And once I do, I will share that with the members, because I think that'll be more of a good news story. As far as the member's question is concerned, I mean, I'm willing to look at any other options that we have out there, if that means increasing the number of summer students that we hire. And if we can, we're always willing to look at a number of different options, and we will do that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tada Council Member Tunade Walade.
Mr. Speaker, I've talked to some small business owners here in the city, mostly. I don't have a lot of small business owners in my riding, but talked to some of the people here where the majority of the summer students get employment. And one of the things I mentioned in my member statement was tax credits. I was wondering if the Minister of Finance would look at some sort of tax credits for industry or other small business for hiring of summer students. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I said in my previous comment, I mean, that is another option, and it's a very interesting concept. And I mean, these are options that are worth exploring, and I will commit to the member that that we will do that. I mean, there's probably a lot to it. We'll see how burdensome it is administratively, but I mean, I'm sure there's ways we can overcome that. But to answer the member's question, we will look at that. We will explore that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundere Council Member Tunade Walade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have about a month and a half before the students start arriving from wherever they're going to school, coming back looking for work. I'd like to ask the Minister if he agrees to have his staff, the Human Resources Division, work with the other departments as soon as possible to start planning for the hiring of summer students. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, absolutely. We have a, on the Department of Finance Human Resource website, we have a portal there for summer students to put in application. I'm not sure what the status of the number of applications are right now. I will gather that information and I'll flip it to the member. But we're always looking, and summer students know that are coming back from school that there's opportunities, so they know where they need to apply. But again, I'll check on the status of the number of applications we may have received and share the information with the member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, the member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have questions for the Minister of Infrastructure, and this is something I've brought up multiple times. It's something that gets brought up to me a lot. It's dredging in the Port of Hay River. This is more important than ever. The government is committed to invest millions of dollars in a new fish plant to revitalize the fishery. It now owns Marine Transportation Services, which requires use of those waterways. We're looking to encourage tourism, so we need a safe harbor. And the minister has stated many times that safety is his number one priority. And so I'd like an update. What is going on with dredging? What progress has been made getting the Port of Hay River dredged? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're pursuing federal funding through the Ocean Protection Plan, and for members of this House, that's a different pot of money from the bilaterals that we've signed. Federal government has set aside $1.5 billion for the nation for 5 years moving forward from 2017-18 on this. Our Department of Infrastructure has been in conversations with different federal agencies because this pot of money has more than one federal minister in charge of it. It's got Transport Canada, it's got Canadian Coast Guard, and I believe the Minister of Environment is also involved in that. But it's funny that the member asked me this question today because our staff is actually down in Ottawa today meeting with Canadian Coast Guard and pursuing what kind of opportunities have we got through this funding arrangement that's coming forward with the federal government on this project. And when I get more information on the exact funding advancements that are possible through this program, I will update the House on that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nakita Cassie, member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's great information. I realize it's early days, as the minister always says, but does he have a schedule as to when we might know about the amount of funding and when this work might actually begin? Thank you.
Massey, Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, we're in discussions. I believe that the federal government wants to sign off on some of this money moving forward. They have 5 different programs, I think, under this, with 57 different initiatives for all of Canada. But the one that they announced in last August for the northern 3 territories, I guess, be us, Nunavut, and Nunavut, is the Safety Equipment and Basic Marine Infrastructure Program, and that's the one we're in discussions with the federal government on this right now. Under this initiative, they want to look at doing something with 30 northern communities, including all 3 territories, and that's what we're negotiating with them and having discussions on how this is going to move forward. And then once we get something signed up, I'll have a better idea of a schedule and the funding opportunities of what that's going to go towards, because we have a significant ask around a number of things, and the dredging of Port of Hay River is a priority, but it's only one of the things on the list. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tata Cassie, member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the minister have any information about the costs of dredging the port? I know when you're asking for money, you usually have to ask for a specific amount of money. So does the minister have that information for us? Thank you.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have that level of detail in front of me. I know that the stuff that we identified under marine priorities comes to about $55 million for our ask. And when I said that, this pot of money that they're talking about right now for $94 million, I don't know what we're going to get funded, but I can get the breakout what it would be looked at to restore the harbor in Hay River for the member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question, Nundere Cassie, member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I mentioned fishing, marine transportation, tourism. There's also talk of N.W.T taking more responsibility from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. We have the new marine training facility, which is a federal facility. So there's a lot going on in regards to the Port of Hay River. So is the minister confident that before the end of this term, given the fact that the feds are more invested now than ever, is the minister confident by the end of this term we'll have that port dredged or at least work begun? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My hope is to have the Port of Hay River at least started on the dredging, but we have to secure funding. We'll have to see what the appetite of the federal government is to help partner with us to do this. We know it's a priority for us now that we own MTS and federal dollars are invested in some of the marine stuff in Hay River, and Canadian Coast Guard also has an investment in it. So we're pursuing these dollars the best we can, and yes, I certainly hope we can be able to say we're going to at least start looking after the restoration of the harbor in Hay River. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, Canada, the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions today are for the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. Earlier today, I spoke a little bit about the barriers and some of the challenges that, in particular, Indigenous people have in accessing post-secondary education. Sometimes I think we need to kind of look at what some of the gaps are between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And I'd just like to start maybe by asking the Minister if the department has done any work with regard to identifying those gaps that we have here in the North between Indigenous and non-Indigenous children or students. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think we can start off in terms of how we support our post-secondary students, Indigenous or non, with our Student Financial Assistance Program. We've made some improvements and enhancements to those over the years. But really what it comes down to is starting very young, and we've made some very big investments in early childhood. We're looking at our education renewal initiatives from the JK to 12 system. We're looking at creating a new pathways to graduation in the high school system. So it takes a combination of all of those investments that will see more success in our Indigenous students and families, right from JK up to grade 12, and then hopefully they do graduate and we can get them into a path that they choose to do, whether it's post-secondary education, whether it's a career, getting right into the career workforce. And we want to support our students to succeed right across the Northwest Territories. So it's a combination of a lot of investments, Mr. Speaker, our productive choices with people that are on income assistance as well. But it takes a lot of factors to take into consideration to ensure that all of our students succeed in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question, Nakita Day, Council Member, Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, I appreciate the Minister's comments, and we're certainly grateful for a lot of the good work that the department does. And student financial assistance is something that is in many ways unique to the North, and we benefit greatly as a society for it. But I just want to go back to the gaps again. One thing that we have to identify is that clearly we have statistical information that indicates that Indigenous students are behind as it relates to graduation rates and et cetera in moving forward. So I just want to again ask the Minister, you know, what kind of work have they done to identify those gaps? What kind of measures or statistics are they keeping so that they can be aware of what work still lies ahead to lessen those gaps? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think that's a focus for any jurisdiction, is how do we identify gaps and challenges, and how do we mitigate them so that we have our students succeeding to completion of either their programs or getting the degrees that they need so they can be part of the working society. And ways we do that is through counseling. We also have looking at creating better supports within the post-secondary systems within Aurora College or within our other post-secondary partners that we work with. It's always a challenge, and we got to find unique ways to identify those challenges. And I know that member from DHO had mentioned some around culture and promoting culture and in traditions to help with succeeding in those areas. But we got to find a way to make sure that we address those barriers so that our students get to succeed in life, really. And like I said, it is a combination of all the work that we're doing right now, and it starts with the early childhood and the work that we're doing around education renewal to set them up for post-secondary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Untitled Chapter, Council Member, Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I also talked about some of the challenges of we have parents, and sometimes single parents, that are trying to make their way in post-secondary education. And it is certainly, you know, children are obviously the greatest gift that we have, but of course they are an expense. Student financial assistance is doing good things to help us afford to go to post-secondary education. But can the Minister let us know, is there any additional resources or financial supports that a single parent or parents could apply for to help with childcare while they're working towards getting a post-secondary diploma or degree? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As members know, we did make some changes to the when the Canada Child Benefit came into place, as well as we made changes to our own legislation for the N.W.T child benefit to help more low to moderate income families on that area. We have been working with the campuses and all of the in Smith, Inuvik, and Yellowknife to address those, and we've heard that as a concern as childcare is important for students that are going to school. We are also working on how do we create affordable and accessible childcare in the 11 communities that don't have childcare currently. So there's that poses a barrier in itself, and we've got to find ways to address those so that single parents or even families have that opportunity to healthy education. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundere Council Member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for identifying what it is that we are trying to accomplish with regard to helping out with childcare here in the North. But can the Minister describe any resources or supports that a young individual who's taking post-secondary in the South might have access to, or additional supports that our government might be able to provide to help them with early child or with childcare while going to school in the South? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I encourage any of the students that are experience any kind of concerns or issues going down to post-secondary education in the South for the first time to possibly call their client service officer at the Student Financial Assistance Office. We also have supports through our Indigenous governments and our partnerships, and we work with them on how to identify some of those barriers and challenges. I also know that a lot of our Indigenous governments take students that are about to graduate on tours of post-secondary institutions down in the South to give them an idea of how it's going to be when they get down there. But anyone that is having trouble, I encourage them to call their client service officers here at the office and get some assistance. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My questions are for the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment, who's responsible for the minimum wage. As I pointed out earlier today, the latest report on minimum wage is a rehash of the 2014 report. It was produced by a committee that is not at arm's length from government, and it contained no preferred recommendation. Is the Minister willing to revise the terms of reference for the Minimum Wage Committee to make it more independent of government and give direction that a preferred recommendation needs to be put forward? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just a little information for members and the public. The Minimum Wage Committee was made in 2013, and its main sole purpose was to meet and review relevant information, research, data to determine suitable options for a change to the minimum wage. Every 2 years they review this area of the minimum wage, and they bring options to myself, and we make the decisions on what meets the needs of not only the employees but also the employers. We got to make sure that there's a fine balance, that we don't put extra hardships on our employers when we do look at increases to the minimum wage. The committee is made up of business individuals as well as and non-government organizations, and I think it brings a very good balanced perspective, and at this time I do not see a need for change in that area. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cassie member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Well, I'm disappointed to hear that when you have two reports and they're virtually carbon copies of each other, something is not right. And I've made a suggestion about how the minister can improve it, but he doesn't seem to want to take that. So I'll try a different tack here. Another issue is indexing. 8 other Canadian jurisdictions now index their minimum wage or intend to begin this practice soon. This is something the minister could begin to do now without waiting for the next round of review. Will the minister direct that the N.W.T minimum wage now be indexed to inflation or cost of living? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, setting the minimum wage to increase with inflation could actually limit our ability to explore other options for adjusting the minimum wage rates. When prior to the forming of the Minimum Wage Committee, They did look at such measures as consumer price index. At that time, it was felt that having this committee of business, labor organizations, and the community was the best way to go to look at all areas that would help set the options for minimum wage. So at this time, directing the minimum wage be indexed to inflation, not looking at it at this time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Untitled Chapter, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Well, I'm getting some straight answers from the minister today, which is a little unusual. I have described the living wage, which is a defensible figure calculated through a nationally recognized procedure. Our territorial data does not allow for detailed calculation of a living wage for each of our communities. So will the minister commit to working with his colleague, the Minister of Finance, and where necessary, Statistics Canada, to expand the range of data collection in our communities to enable calculation of a local living wage? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, currently there's no jurisdiction in all of Canada that has legislated living wage as part of minimum wage policy. I feel that the way we look at our minimum wage and review that minimum wage every 2 years, that we're doing what is best for not only the employees, but as I mentioned earlier, what's best for the employers, and that I can bring this to Cabinet and have those discussions, but at this time, we're going to continue with the process of how we develop and determine what a minimum wage is every 2 years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Untitled Chapter, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. So I guess what I'm hearing from the minister is the status quo is okay, and when Alberta has a higher minimum wage than we do this fall, people should just move to Alberta. Currently, recipients of income support receive allowances that are adjusted according to where a person lives, and that reflects differential cost of living. If this principle applies to income support, why don't we apply it to the minimum wage? Will the minister commit to beginning the work to develop a methodology to calculate a local living wage for all of our communities and move the minimum wage to a living wage? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just to give a little informational here, when we increased the minimum wage come April 1st of this year, about 700 people in the Northwest Territories will be affected, will be getting an increase. Having a living wage, as I mentioned, would possibly have some impacts on our employers. And we all know that a lot of our businesses and people that do business in the Northwest Territories don't even pay the minimum wage. They pay a lot higher than that, and then get into the higher communities, it gets even higher. So we won't be looking at a living wage, and we'll continue the same route that we're on. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nicolette Cannon, the member YELLOWKNIFE Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members on this side of the House have received variable answers about the future of the social work program. We have heard both that the program is phased out and will continue to be phased out, and we've also heard that the results of the foundational review are important to the future of the program. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister of Education and Culture and Employment is, which one is it? Thank you.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The foundation review was a process that we took on as a GNW, as a government, and we're looking at a whole bunch of different areas, and it's not all focused on programs. There's governance, there's operations, there's administration, there's recruitment, retention, to give the direction of where the college is going. We're going to use that information to help set the long-term strategic plan for the Aurora College, and that review, the internal review that the Aurora College is doing on their own, that will also possibly help us set the direction moving forward. But the main focus right now is to get that foundational review complete with the management response and help us move forward with other supporting documents such as the skills for success, as well as our labour markets needs assessment and information that we have, that data, will all help us plan a good direction for the Aurora College going into the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral questions. Nakita Dayakasi, member Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the minister has given me another and/or answer. So he said that the results of the social work program review will possibly figure into what happens to the program there. So for the second time, I'm asking, is how is the minister approaching the results of the foundational review and the social work program review with respect to the future of this program? Does it have a future? Thank you.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We don't know what's going to be in the internal review of the social work program. We don't know what's in the final report of the foundational review. Once we get those, we are going to develop a management response, as I've mentioned in this House, that's going to work on looking at the recommendations. Is going to give us an opportunity to consider the feasibility of each of the recommendations. It's also going to talk about the analysis of the recommendations and how we implement them so that all our stakeholders, that all members of this House can make evidence-based decisions. So until we know what those are, we can't really make a decision here. But everything will be taken into consideration. As I mentioned, the main priority right now is to get this foundation review complete. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tada Dayakasi, member Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to ask the simplest question possible. Is the minister committed to phasing out the social work program? Thank you.
Yes. Masi. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the current budget and the current steps we've taken, we are looking at phasing this current program that is currently at the college out after this year. That's why there was no intakes. What comes out of the foundation review, the direction of the college, we will use that information to make evidence-based decisions and whether or not they will have a degree granting program or whether they can change direction and do other types of degree granting bachelor programs. But we'll have to get that foundational review complete first. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question, Nunde Dayakasi, member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if I was one of the students in this program, I would be very confused about what the future held for me in September at Aurora College. The minister is trying to have it both ways, that it's phased out, but the foundational review is going to be important to its future. I'll just ask this from another direction. The minister says he's all about the evidence, which is great. So what evidence does the minister need to reinstate the social work program? Thank you.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the students that are currently in the social work program were given all the information that they needed in terms of moving forward. They're also getting the supports they need to graduate and to complete their program. And once the whole discussion started about the social work program, they understood it, the staff understood it, and Aurora College senior management understood it. And the kind of data that we need to look at is these evidence-based decisions that are coming out of this foundation review. Look at the recommendations, and I said that's the most important piece of work that needs to be completed first. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, the member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have some follow-up questions with the Minister of Health and Social Services. My first question is, what is the next action plan that is coming out of the mental health and addiction strategy framework? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there were to be 3 different action plans coming out of the framework. The first one, the Youth Mental Health and Addictions Action Plan, is out, and we're already moving forward with that. The next 2 action plans are the Mental Health Recovery Action Plan, and the next one would be the Addictions Recovery Plan. We're working on both of those now. We hope to have them out in 18-19 fiscal year, preferably in time to help inform the next round of business planning. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Nakirade, Council Member Nehende.
I thank the minister for that answer. In this House today, we talked about, and during the budget, we've heard about the Department of Health and Social Services and Education, Culture, and Employment are partnering together to create this new position called Child and Youth Career Counseling. Where are these positions going to be located during the school year and non-school year? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're going forward with 2 regions this year. One of the regions that we happen to be going forward with is the DAY26, and what we're looking for in the DAY26 is to establish three new counselor positions as well as 1 new clinical supervisor. The 3 counseling positions, one's going to be located in Fort Liard, one's going to be in Fort Simpson, and the other one's going to be in Fort Providence. The clinical supervisor is going to be in Fort Simpson. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. Tadade, Council Member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think I may have given the wrong question here, and I'll have to clarify it. So the question is, with these positions, I know the 3 positions that are going into Fort Liard, Fort Providence, and Fort Simpson, are they going to be in the schools year-round, or are they going to be just in the schools during the school year, or is there going to be a combination of these positions being placed? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what we heard clearly from the residents of the Northwest Territories, in particular the youth that we engaged during our planning for this action plan, is that the youth wanted access year-round to counselors, not just during the academic year. But they still wanted access to the counselors through the schools. So we'll be working with the DEAs and the schools to set up some sort of agreements to articulate how much time these individuals will be spending in the school. It's our anticipation or our expectation that during the school year, the majority of their time will be spent in the schools. Outside of the school year, the majority or all of their time will be spent out of the Health and Social Services offices that exist. There may be time for them to come out of the schools during the school year, because one of the other things we heard is that some of the youth who are struggling the most aren't attending school. We want to make sure that we don't miss those youth as well. So during the school year, the majority of the time will be in the schools, the rest of the time out of the health centers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Nodere, Council Member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for that answer, and I think it's a very positive step. How will the youth from the smaller communities that be able to address their concerns? How are we going to be able to address that? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we did have a public meeting with the committee, and the information on how we determined where the councillors were going was included in that presentation, including the indication that some of the smaller communities where the school sizes are much smaller, we wouldn't be putting a councillor in those communities. Having said that, one of the reasons we've gone with a clinical supervisor is not only to provide clinical direction and support to the councillors, but also to help coordinate the outreach to the smaller communities. Our councillors will be, setting up relationships with the youth in those smaller communities. We've also got the traveling counseling support team that exists through Education, Culture, and Employment that are going to be reaching out to the communities as well. So there are a number of ways that we're intending to reach out to the kids in the small communities, including person-to-person contact and follow-up by phones and other media that exist. We can use other things like teleconferencing or telehealth or even Skype if it's appropriate, depending on the situation. But we're definitely planning to have outreach to youth in all of the smaller communities, as well as the communities where the positions are located. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Time for oral question has expired. Written questions. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, given the concerns that have been raised by the Information and Privacy Commissioner in her 2016-2017 annual report in regards of the ability of the Department of Health and Social Services to meet its statutory requirements under the Health Information Act with its existing information technology systems, I have questions for the minister responsible. Please provide a comprehensive list of all proprietary and non-proprietary information systems currently used by the health authorities, including descriptions of each system and the developers of any proprietary systems. Please indicate which health information systems are used to manage healthcare patient information, including details of what information is contained in those systems. Please provide details on any work that is being done by the Department of Health and Social Services to modify existing information systems to be compliant with the Health Information Act. And finally, please provide a cost estimate of any modification to existing healthcare information systems to be compliant with the Health Information Act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Standing Committee on Government Operations is pleased to present its report on the review of the 2017 report on the of the Auditor General on climate change in the Northwest Territories. The Auditor General's report was tabled in the Legislative Assembly on October 18, 2017. The Standing Committee on Government Operations held its public review of this performance audit report on January 17, 2018. Committee members would like to thank the Auditor General and officials from his office for preparing the report, for traveling to Yellowknife where the report was tabled, and again when it was reviewed, and for assisting the committee during the public review. The committee also thanks the Deputy Minister of Environment and Natural Resources and the Deputy Minister of Infrastructure and officials from their respective departments for their appearances before the committee. Mr. Speaker, although the government is a small emitter of greenhouse gases, the Northwest Territories is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, which threaten the livelihood of our residents and their way of life, particularly in remote Indigenous N.W.T communities. The impacts wrought by climate change include warming, increased variation in precipitation, and extreme weather events. For these reasons, the Auditor General's report points out that responding to the impacts of climate change is a shared responsibility requiring partnerships within and across governments and with non-governmental organizations, industry, and the public. The Department of Environment and Natural Resources is the lead department for climate change in the Northwest Territories, with the responsibility to lead the development of strategies to address greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to climate change impacts, lead the sharing of climate change information to support government departments and the public in their adaptation efforts, promote the use of scientific research, traditional knowledge, and public education to understand climate change in the Northwest Territories, and represent the territorial government in national climate change initiatives. The department is also responsible to maintain, conserve, and protect the condition, quality, diversity, and abundance of the environment, including water, air, wildlife, habitat, and forests in the Northwest Territories. The Department of Infrastructure is responsible for promoting energy efficiency and in the management of N.W.T assets and adapting them to the impacts of climate change. It's also responsible for adapting the Northwest Territories' transportation infrastructure to the impacts of climate change. With the audit findings, overall, the Auditor General found that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources did not fulfill its leadership role and meet its commitments on climate change, address long-standing deficiencies affecting its leadership on climate change, nor did it assess what authorities and resources it required to fulfill its leadership role. The audit further found the department did not identify the risks to the Northwest Territories posed by climate change or provide departments and communities with easy access to information needed to take action on climate change. Despite a commitment to do so almost 10 years ago, the department failed to establish a territorial strategy to adapt to climate change. This lack of leadership led to a piecemeal approach as departments and communities pursued their own adaptation efforts. This left ENR without the ability to know what the N.W.T was doing to adapt to climate change, whether it was doing enough to mitigate the greatest risks, or whether individual adaptation actions negatively affected one another. Additionally, the audit found, while ENR focused its climate change efforts on developing greenhouse gas strategies, it did not set meaningful emissions targets or focus on the greatest emitters. As a result, the 2011-2015 territorial greenhouse gas strategy did not have a significant impact on reducing emission levels. Finally, with respect to adapting to climate change impacts, the audit found that while the department did set out protections for some vulnerable wildlife species, it had no overall adaptation plan to better protect wildlife and ensure that areas of greatest risk were being addressed. To the Department of Infrastructure, with respect to adapting to climate change impacts, the audit found that the Department of Infrastructure identified specific adaptation actions to protect public roads and buildings from the risks posed by climate change, but these were only routinely carried out for roads. The department assessed the climate change risks for public buildings, such as health centres and hospitals, and determined the two greatest risks to be permafrost degradation affecting foundations and snow loads affecting roof stability. The audit found that the department did not develop a formal climate change adaptation plan for public buildings and often did not follow its own practices for the operations and maintenance of public buildings. The audit found that the Department of Infrastructure developed a climate change plan for transportation infrastructure in 2013. The plan identified all weather and winter roads as the greatest areas of risk and committed to a range of adaptive actions to manage these risks accordingly. The audit found that the department did not regularly conduct required inspections of all-weather roads to identify necessary maintenance and rehabilitation. While the department inspected 90% of large culverts, approximately 50% of the small culverts the department should have inspected were not inspected. Despite these issues, the Auditor General found that infrastructure did take some positive steps to manage the impacts of climate change. The audit found that the department worked with various partners to undertake research and test new technologies for climate change adaptation. The committee takes this opportunity to acknowledge the Department of Infrastructure for this work. Audit recommendations. The report of the Auditor General contains a total of 8 recommendations. For the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, 5 recommendations are related to its leadership role for climate change, and 1 is related to wildlife management actions to adequately adapt to climate change. The final 2 recommendations of the Auditor General are directed towards the Department of Infrastructure's work relating to adapting to climate change impacts. The Standing Committee endorses all of these recommendations made by the Office of the Auditor General and recommends that the departments ensure these are implemented in a timely manner. Committee observations and recommendations. Although compliance audits are backwards-looking, the value of such an exercise lies in assessing past performance shortfalls with a view to improving future performance. In this vein, the Standing Committee's observations and recommendations are intended to provide the departments with additional insight to assist them in implementing actions that will ultimately help fulfill the recommendations made by the Auditor General. The Auditor General's key findings in the 2017 report on climate change in the Northwest Territories is that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources failed in a very fundamental way and over an extended period of time to fulfill the leadership role that is necessary for the Northwest Territories to plan for, mitigate, and adapt to climate change and the drastic consequences it holds for the Northwest Territories. This is a very concerning finding and should be met with serious consideration. The committee notes that of the 5 recommendations of the Office of the Auditor General related to the department's failure to show leadership, all 5 responses point to the department's climate change strategic framework as the answer to this failure. This suggests to the committee that the department on a very foundational level fails to appreciate the gravity of the Auditor General's finding. ENR also does not recognize that improvement will take a concerted effort on a number of fronts and will not be achieved solely through the delivery of a strategic framework, something that the department has repeatedly failed to do in the past decade. The committee has heard both the Deputy Minister during the public hearing and the Minister in the Legislative Assembly make the point that the audit period did not address the department's work on the climate change strategic framework, with the inference being that the utility of the audit was therefore limited. The committee is disappointed with this dismissive response, which attempts to minimize the Auditor General's findings. The committee would have preferred to hear some acknowledgement that the audit findings point to deep-rooted systemic problems that have persisted over a decade or more. For these problems to be adequately addressed, they must first be acknowledged. The committee encourages the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources, his cabinet colleagues, and the department's senior management to do some soul-searching, reflect on past mistakes, and ensure those mistakes are not repeated. The committee takes this opportunity to recognize with sincerity the effort and dedication and hard work of the employees of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. The committee's observations should not be construed in any way as criticism of the department's hard-working public servants, but rather as a critique of poor management decisions, which resulted in the department's hard work being less effective than it might have been. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, according to the Auditor General, The measures taken by the Department of Environment and Natural Resources and the Department of Infrastructure were not adequate to fulfill the government's climate change commitments to reduce territorial gas emissions and to adapt to climate change impacts in the Northwest Territories. While the committee is encouraged that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources accepted the Auditor General's recommendations, the responses to some of these recommendations were so vague as to leave the Standing Committee with little assurance that appropriate steps will be taken by the department to meet the challenge of fulfilling its leadership role. The Standing Committee makes the following 11 recommendations. Further detail specific to each recommendation is contained within the body of the committee's report. As previously noted, these recommendations are largely designed to help the departments meet the recommendations made by the Auditor General and to assist the department to address the deficiencies found by the audit, not as a source of criticism. Recommendation 1, the Standing Committee on Government Operation endorses the 8 recommendations made by the Office of the Auditor General in its report and recommends the Department of Environment and Natural Resources and the Department of Infrastructure take the steps necessary to ensure that all recommendations are fully implemented in a timely manner. Recommendation 2, the Standing Committee again recommends that in future, any N.W.T. department being audited provide the Standing Committee on Government Operations with a copy of its action or implementation plan at the earliest possible opportunity and no later than 3 business days prior to the public review on the Auditor General's report, consistent with the process convention on communications between Cabinet Ministers, Standing Committees, and regular members. Recommendation 3, the Standing Committee recommends that in future any government department selected for an audit provide the Standing Committee on Government Operations with a copy of its action plan or implementation plan in draft format, and further, that the document not be finalized until the department has an opportunity to consider the recommendations made as a result of the Standing Committee's review. Recommendation 4, the Standing Committee recommends that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources acknowledge and reference the Auditor General's report and recommendations in the Climate Change Strategic Framework. Recommendation 5, the Standing Committee recommends that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources bring forward a draft Climate Change Strategic Framework Action Plan for the consideration of the Standing Committee no later than May 11th, 2018, which identifies specific activities to be undertaken by the department in support of the Climate Change Strategic Framework and in response to the recommendations of the Auditor General. Recommendation 6, the Standing Committee recommends that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources bring forward a draft Knowledge Agenda Action Plan for the consideration of the Standing Committee by no later than May 11th, 2018, which identifies specific activities to be undertaken by the department in support of the Climate Change Strategic Framework and in response to the recommendations of the Auditor General. Recommendation 7, the Standing Committee recommends that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources report annually on progress being made to meet the greenhouse gas emission targets established in the Climate Change Strategic Framework and remain open to the possibility of making target adjustments as required to meet the overall emissions reduction targets by 2030. Recommendation 8, the Standing Committee on Government Operations recommends that the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources, with Cabinet endorsement and participation, hold a ministerial roundtable on climate change in the Northwest Territories as a method for seeking industry input into the Climate Change Strategic Framework and to secure commitments at the political level that industry will work to meet with targets set in the CCSF. Recommendation 9, the Standing Committee recommends that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources give consideration to the development of the following procedural authority instruments: a Territorial Climate Change Act, a formal N.W.T. climate change policy, memoranda of understanding identifying ministerial and department responsibilities for climate change initiatives, and an assessment exercise designed to identify and provide the department with sufficient capacity to fulfill its leadership role. The Standing Committee further recommends that ENR report back to the committee on its consideration of these recommendations, identifying those procedural authoritative instruments it will adopt together with reasons for any decision to not proceed with these instruments. Recommendation 10, the Standing Committee recommends that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources identify in its Climate Change Strategic Framework Action Plan specific measures that will be undertaken with associated timelines to fulfill the wildlife management actions recommended by the Auditor General, including the development of an inventory of commitments already identified as important to addressing climate change impacts on wildlife with a view to ensuring those commitments are met. And finally, recommendation 11, the Standing Committee recommends that the Government of the Northwest Territories provide a response to this report within 120 days. I will conclude, Mr. Speaker, by noting that the Standing Committee will be monitoring the Department's progress on this work and looks forward to receiving substantive progress reports. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I now Move seconded by the honourable member for Hay River North, that Committee Report 6-18 brackets 3 be deemed read and printed in Hansard in its entirety. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Motion's in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Report on a review of 2017 Report of Auditor General of Canada on Climate Change in Northwest Territories is deemed as read. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports of Committee on the Review of Bills. Reports of Committee on the Review of Bills. Tabling of documents. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following two documents entitled Supplementary Estimates, Operations Expenditures Number 1, 2018-19, and Interactivity Transfers exceeding $250,000, April 1st to September 30th, 2017. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Tabling of documents. Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on behalf of my cabinet colleagues, I wish to table the following three documents entitled Correspondence with Prime Minister Trudeau regarding N.W.T. Legislative Assembly motion, apology and compensation to the Yellowknife Dene First Nation relating to damages from the giant mine, the Workers' Safety Compensation Commission Annual Report 2016, Northwest Territories and Nunavut, and Workers' Advisory Office for the Northwest Territories and Nunavut Annual Report 2017. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tabling of documents. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following document entitled Consolidated Annual Financial Reports for all N.W.T. District Education Authorities and District Education Councils, June 30th, 2017. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tabling of documents. Minister of Industry, Tourism, and Investment.
Speaker, I wish to table the following document entitled Follow-up Letter for Oral Question 122-18 bracket 3, Procurement Policies and Impacts on Non-Government Organizations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Tabling of documents. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I wish to table the following three documents. The first is a 1984 release for the Prairie Creek site. The second is a 1987 surface lease for the Prairie Creek site. And the third document is a 2003 surface lease for the Prairie Creek site. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Pursuant to Section 28 of the Financial Administration Act, I wish to table the following 2017-2018 and 2018-2019 N.W.T. Human Rights Commission budgets. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Motions. Motions. First reading of bills. Government House Leader.
Speaker, I move, seconded by the honourable member for Hay River South, that Bill 8, Emergency Management Act, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Motions in order. Motions non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 8 has had its first reading. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the honourable member for Hay River South, excuse me, that Bill 10, Supplementary Appropriation Act Infrastructure Expenditures Number 4, 2017-2018 be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Motions in order. Motions non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 10 has had its first reading. First reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the honourable member for Great Slave, that Bill 11, Supplementary Appropriation Act Operation Expenditures Number 4, 2017-2018 be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Let's see. Motion's in order. Motion is non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 11 has had its first reading. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the honourable member for Hay River South, that Bill 10, Supplementary Appropriation Act Infrastructure Expenditures 2017-2018 be read for the second time. Mr. Speaker, this bill makes supplementary appropriations for infrastructure expenditures for the government of the Northwest Territories for the 2017-2018 fiscal year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Motion's in order. To the principle of the bill. Question's been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 10 has had its second reading. Second reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the honourable member for Great Slave, that Bill 11, Supplementary Appropriation Act Operation Expenditures Number 4, 2017-2018 be read for the second time. Mr. Speaker, this bill makes supplementary appropriations for operation expenditures for the government of the Northwest Territories for the 2017-2018 fiscal year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Motion's in order. To the principle of the bill. Question's been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 11 has had its second reading. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration Committee of the Whole Bills and Other Matters. Minister Statement 1-18.3, Minister Statement 19-18.3, Table Document 140-18.3 with Member Hay River North in the chair.
I now call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Bolio.
Mr. Speaker, committee would like to consider table document 140-18 brackets 3, supplementary estimates, operations estimates number 1, 2018-2019. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. We have agreed to consider table document 140-18 brackets 3. Does the Minister of Finance have any opening remarks? Minister McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I am here to present supplementary estimates operation expenditures number 1, 2018-2019. This document provides for an increase of $1.1 million to the operations budget. These supplementary estimates include $200,000 for funding for the N.W.T. Arts Council, $300,000 to establish 2 new government service officer positions in Jean Marie River and Sault McKay, and $578,000 to establish 2 new land specialist positions to address equity lease issues over the next 3 years. That concludes my opening remarks. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Do you wish to bring witnesses into the chamber?
I would, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Sergeant at Arms, please escort the witnesses into the chamber. Minister, would you please introduce your witness for the record?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I have with me today Mr. David Sturt, who is the Deputy Minister of the Department of Finance. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Committee, we have agreed to forego general comments, so we will move directly into the detail. Please turn to page 4 of the tabled document. Do we have comments or questions on this detail? Page 4. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can the minister just confirm if this is ongoing funding or a single one-time appropriation? Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's ongoing.
Thank you, Mr. Testart.
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the minister for that clarification. I think this is again something that we heard very loudly from the arts community, and I'm really pleased the minister has brought this forward. Happy to support it, and I'm happy even more so that it's ongoing funding, and hopefully we can get a few more dollars next business plan. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Anything further from committee? Seeing none, supplementary estimates, operation expenditures, number 1, 2018-2019, education, culture and employment, operations expenditures, culture, heritage and languages not previously authorized, $200,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Education, culture and employment, operation expenditures, total department not previously authorized, $200,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Please turn to page 5. Supplementary estimates, operations expenditures, number 1, 2018-2019, Executive and Indigenous Affairs, operations expenditures, Directorate not previously authorized, $300,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Executive and Indigenous Affairs, operations expenditures, total department not previously authorized, $300,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Please continue to page 6. Supplementary estimates, operations expenditures, number 1, 2018-2019, lands, operations expenditures, operations not previously authorized, $578,000. Does committee agree? Mr. O'Reilly, continue.
Yes, Mr. Chair, can someone just explain what this funding is for? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, this money is for additional positions to, I've got to get my glasses on here. Establish 2 new positions to address equity leases over the next 3 years. And that's in addition to the 3 positions that were already there. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
So, Mr. Chair, can the minister or his staff tell us where these 3 positions are going to be located? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In addition to the previous 3 that I just spoken to, plus the 2 that we're adding now, there's going to be 2 in Fort Smith, 1 in Inuvik, 1 in Fort Simpson, and 1 in Yellowknife. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So, and I think the 3 that were in the 2018-19 budget itself, they were going to be located in Fort Smith. Is that correct? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. It was initially 3, but 2 are going into Fort Smith, and 1 in Inuvik, 1 in Fort Simpson, and 1 in Yellowknife. That gives us the 5 positions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chair. So now I'm more confused than ever. How many positions are there going to be created as a result of the supplementary appropriation and what's in the 2018-19 budget already? How many total positions, and where are they all going to be located? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister.
So we're at. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, this supplementary appropriation will add 2 new positions in addition to the 3 that were identified in the main budget document. And I believe in the main budget document, the 3 that were identified in there were actually going to go to Fort Smith. But after having some discussions with committee, we determined that we will add 2 new positions, recognizing that there are a number of leases that need to be taken care of. So that would have brought the total to 5, and we decided that 2 would go in Fort Smith, 1 would go in Inuvik, 1 in Fort Simpson, and 1 in Yellowknife. So 2 new positions as a result of this supplementary appropriation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
I'm just so some information was provided to committee in terms of where the outstanding equity leases were located, and the most equity leases are actually found in Fort Providence at 58, and there was only 6 in Fort Smith. So has there been any consideration given to having one of these positions located in Fort Providence, where most of the equity leases are located? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, a couple of factors. We'd have to look at the availability of office space, and I mean, I take the member's point. I've seen the numbers. We'd have to look at the availability of office space and being able to set up in the community. I don't know if the final decision has been made yet. I suppose the Department of Lands would have to look at all the information that's provided and then make a final decision as to whether it's going to be in Fort Simpson or Fort Providence. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. The Minister of Lands indicated he would like to speak to this. Minister Siebert.
Yes, after the initial discussions, Mr. Chair, with respect to this matter, we went from 3 to 5 positions as there was an interest to resolve this matter faster, and we will have to make the allocation of positions dependent, of course, on office space and some other considerations. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for that, Minister. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think one way to get this done faster is to actually probably move one of those positions from Fort Smith and put it in Fort Providence, where most of the equity leases are located. So I'll just make that recommendation to my friend, the Minister of Lands, and to my colleague, the Minister of Finance. If they'd like to respond, I'd be happy to hear it, but that'd be my recommendation. You want to deal with this faster, put the bodies where the problems are. Not that there's problems with Fort Providence, but there's an outstanding number of equity leases there. That's the highest number of any of the communities. Put the person there so they can resolve it faster. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Wish to respond? Any minister? Minister McLeod?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and recommendation noted.
Thank you. Supplementary estimates, operations, expenditures, number 1, 2018-2019. Mr. Nadley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to speak on this matter here. Just the idea of trying to create 2 positions to address the equity lease issues, and just to trying to move forward on the matter. There has been at least an assessment of whether indeed the position could be realized for the community of Fort Providence. I understand that there had been some initial, at least indication of just the current office space that houses the current employees, N.W.T employees at the SSI Center, and I understand there is available office space that could be quickly mobilized to at least create a position in the community. So I'm just seeking whether a decision has been formalized and this is a go forward, or would a small community once again maybe realize some benefits, at least from most of the government positions being in headquarters or else regional centers, but at least for a small community to be considered to receive a position such as this, so that you have actually feet on the ground to try to at least get an understanding of the issue and to try to move forward. Merci.
Thank you. Minister McLeod.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, again, I'm not sure if the decision has been finalized. What I do know is that we brought forward a supplementary appropriation after discussions with committee, recognizing the need to get more bodies on the ground to deal with equity leases. As far as the actual physical location, I'm not sure if that's been finalized. I will have a discussion again with my colleague, the Minister of Lands, and if there's opportunities, again, we said before, and I think the Minister said it as well, that there's a number of factors they look at. But of course, this government wants to see a lot of position go to small communities, but there's got to be a fit there as well. But we'll explore that, and we'll have a discussion with committee.
Thank you, Minister. Would anyone else like to chime in? No? Mr. Nadley? Nothing further from Mr. Nadley. Supplementary estimates, operations expenditures number 1, 2018-2019 lands, operations expenditures, operations not previously authorized, $578,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Lands, operations expenditures, total department not previously authorized, $578,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Do you agree that we have concluded our consideration of table document 140-18 brackets 3 supplementary estimates operations expenditures number 1 2018-2019? Thank you, committee. Thank you to the minister and your witness for appearing before us. Sergeant at Arms, please escort the witness from the chamber. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that consideration of table document 140-18 brackets 3 supplementary estimates operations expenditures number 1 2018-2019 now be concluded, and that table document 140-18 brackets 3 be reported and recommended as ready for further consideration in formal session through the form of an appropriation bill. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. There's a motion. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the chairman of Committee of the Whole leave the chair to report progress. Thank you.
There's a motion to report progress. The motion is in order, non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. I will rise and report progress.
May I have the report, Member Hay River North?
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering table document 140-18 supplementary estimates operations expenditures number 1 2018-2019 and would like to report progress with one motion carried, and that consideration of table document 140-18 is concluded, and that the House concur in those estimates, and that an appropriation bill to be based thereon be introduced without delay. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with.
Merci. Do I have a seconder? Member for Cam Lake. Motion's in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Merci. Third reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move second by the Honourable Member for Hay River South that Bill 10, Supplementary Appropriation Act Infrastructure Expenditures Number 4, 2017-2018 be read for the third time. And Mr. Speaker, I request a recorded vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know I wasn't sure if
Merci. Member requested for a recorded vote. Motion's in order. To the motion. Question's been called. All those in favor, please stand.
Member for Nunavik Twin Lakes, the member for Hay River South, the member for Tabacha, the member for Hay River North, the member for Cam Lake, the member for Nahende, the member for Frame Lake, the member for Yellowknife Centre, the member for DAY26, the member for Inuvik Boot Lake, the member for Great Slave.
All those opposed, please stand. All those abstain, please stand. Merci. The result of the recorded vote, 11 in favor, 0 opposed, 0 abstention. Motion carried. Bill 10 has had a third reading. Third reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Great Slave, that Bill 11, Supplementary Appropriation Act Operation Expenditures Number 4, 2017-18, be read for the third time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Okay, Merci. Motions in order. To the motion. To the motion, Member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to request a recorded vote.
Merci. Members requested for a recorded vote. Motion's in order. To the motion. Question's been called. All those in favor, please stand. Madam Clerk.
The member for Inuvik Twin Lakes, the member for Hay River South, the member for Tabacha, the member for Hay River North, the member for Cam Lake, the member for Nahende, the member for Frame Lake, the member for Yellowknife Centre, the member for DAY26, the member for Inuvik Boot Lake, and the member for Great Slave.
All those opposed, please stand. All those abstain, please stand. The results of the recorded vote, 11 in favor, 0 opposed, 0 abstention. The motion is carried. Bill 11 has had a third reading. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Thursday, March 15th, 2018, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, returns to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgements, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to commissioner's opening address, petitions, reports of standing and special committees, reports of committees on the review of bills, tabling of documents, notices of motion for first reading of bills, motions, motion 14-183, first reading of bills, second reading of bills, Bill 8, consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters, Minister Statement 1-18-3, Minister Statement 19-18-3, report of committee of the whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
Mr. Clerk, this House stands adjourned until Thursday, March 15, 1:30 p.m.